name's Kendall Hartley. I'll do a little more of an introduction in a few minutes here. Sarah, you want to introduce yourself and then I'll jump back in?
Sure. My name is Sarah Wolf, and I am over in the EPHL. Is it LH? I always am get confused. The letters keep changing, but educational psychology is my background. And I am currently a postdoctoral scholar in the Office of Learning Analytics on an NSF grant to study self-regulated learning.
And I am Kendall Hartley, so I'm an associate professor of educational technology here in College of Education. I'm a former high school science teacher, and that's really kind of how I got interested in technology and in self-regulation. I've been here at UNLV since the last millennium. So overview, what we're going to do, I'm going to start a little bit with kind of technology context, some of the amazing things going on right now, and maybe even some look at a bit of the trajectory. I'll start with then a kind of a foundational discussion of self-regulated learning, because I think it's a great framework for understanding these challenges around technology. And then I'll tie that directly to the technology I've been focused on most directly the past few years, which is the smartphone. And then I'm going to pass it off to Sarah, who's going to very ably describe mindful self-regulated learning. She's done some fantastic work in this area for a relatively new scholar. It's quite impressive what she's done, and I'm anxious to let you hear about what she's done. And then we're both going to kind of go back and forth on what we see as possibly some direct implications for educators. And then we hope to move it on to a discussion. This I inserted kind of at the last minute. One of my former jobs was a Radio Shack salesman, which they've been gone long enough to know that dates me even a little bit. But I was so excited at one point I was able to sell one of these things. This is a Tandy 1000 SX. You can get one of these for $1,200. It's pretty impressive. However, it didn't have a hard drive. It only had, I don't know, like 256K of RAM. But you can see down below there, you could buy a hard drive. You could get a 10 megabyte hard drive for $700 that you could add on to that thing. You compare that with that smartphone that's on the right there, which is taking pictures that are 10 megabytes in size. And now even our watches are even possibly more impressive. So we'll fast forward a little bit here in the next slide. I've got a chart that summarizes kind of how quickly these things are changing. If that top line there is just kind of general survey around computers in the home, see 1984, these things kind of get introduced. And there's a relatively gentle slope until now we're up to virtually 100%. Households with internet use at home, that was kind of a similar thing. That's actually the start of that is about where I started teaching high school too. So internet in the schools too was starting about that point, this mid-late 90s. Which again was a fantastic and interesting time. But that took about 25 years then to where we got to virtually everyone having the internet at home. Fast forward to the smartphone, and Steve Jobs introduces the iPhone in 2007-ish. So my chart starts a little bit after that. But here you fast forward to 2020, 2018 really is when I came back from the graduate college and started doing research on what's this all mean for students to learn now that these smartphones are everywhere. And then in the next slide, there's as though those things weren't fast enough. Now we look at how quickly some of these other tools that are quite familiar to us come online. You can see Facebook there. This is the number of months it took to get to 100 million users. So Facebook started a little slow, and 4 years later, there's about 100 million people actually using it. And you can kind of work your way on down there. TikTok, we started asking students what apps they were using in 2018, 2019. TikTok didn't exist. And before we know it, it became the most popular thing amongst the students within that's 9 months. ChatGPT, which some of you have heard about, that was actually introduced in November of last year. And by January, it had 100 million users. And that hasn't seemed to have slowed down. So things are changing rapidly. So how do we deal with all this? So in the next slide, I'm going to start into self-regulated learning, because when I came back and I wanted to restart my research plan, came back from administration, it was clear to me that these tools existed in a way that was going to challenge educators and students significantly. But I knew from my own work back in graduate school and even starting out, and that was my early work was around the internet and self-regulated learning. What are the implications for students trying to learn online and learn in these kind of hypermedia environments? We recognize, we being Lisa Van Dixon and I recognize this is going to be a challenge for students who were poor self-regulators. And so we started with that. So but that stuff existed, self-regulated learning, back in the 80s. So what I use for my model of self-regulated learning, there's several out there. I'm very partial to this one because regulation of cognition and knowledge of cognition came out of a paper written by Greg Schraw, our former colleague who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, but he just did tremendous work. And one of the things he did is he came up with, along with Rain Sperling, who's out at Penn State, this metacognitive awareness inventory. And in a nutshell, he was looking at these two components of self-regulated learning. I realize I have a third there. I'll talk about that in a moment. But this knowledge of cognition and regulation of cognition were the two ways that he kind of mapped it out and had all sorts of interesting items to measure these things. Real briefly, knowledge of cognition is these things that students understand about their own thinking and learning. They understand strategies. They know what might be effective strategies, and they maybe know how to change up strategies. They also kind of had a good sense of what's expected of them. And these are the types of things that really resonated with me as a high school teacher when I was observing students who were struggling. What was the real difference between the students that were doing really well and those that had a more difficult time? And that turned out to be one of those things. It's just their understanding of these strategies around, for example, formulas. I was teaching high school science, the density formula. How could they manipulate it so they could solve for the variable that they needed? Some of the kids had the strategies around how they would manipulate that fraction very easily, whereas the others, they had to go through kind of a long process. That's an example of a strategy that was helpful. Regulation of cognition was the second component, was more kind of the management, or you can think of it as like executive control of your own thinking. Most importantly, kind of monitoring for understanding. This thinking about your thinking. Am I really reading, when I'm reading this, am I really processing it? Do I need to kind of turn back the page a little bit to figure out what I just missed? And it also has to do with regulating their focus. So he came up with a great series, him and others, that asked some really neat items about those particular things. The third component that I have listed here actually comes from Paul Pintrich and his colleagues, another outstanding scholar who unfortunately left us all too early. But he has something called the Motivational Strategies Questionnaire for Learning. I'm messing up it's MSLQ. Within that, he had something called resource management, which is really focused more on kind of some of these more practical things like the environment that students are learning in, managing cognitive load, recognizing when things are too much, and kind of cleaning up your own environment, recognizing that you need to kind of hone in on things. So I use these three things to study students, first-year students at UNLV, in particular at the Academic Success Center. I worked with Dan Giannoutsis and Emily Shreve and Lisa Van Dixon on a series of projects that ended up being really fruitful in terms of helping us understand what those students were bringing to the table when it came to their first year. And just, as a side note, these things are really important. It turns out that when I wanted to predict their first semester GPAs of students, you can anticipate, of course, high school GPA is a great predictor of it. So that one sure was strong. And then you might think like ACTs and SAT scores and those types of things. Turns out that these items that I'm showing here are actually much more important than the ACT and the SAT scores. They're not as predictive as the high school GPA, but they get pretty close. So these are important things. When we ask students these questions, we recognize that this is going to have an impact on how well they do in their coursework. I'm going to tie this into then what we started asking them about smartphones, because I felt like this was a good framework for understanding how smartphones, self-regulated learning would be a good framework for us to understand how smartphones are impacting students. So on the next slide, I kind of broke down the different areas that we ask students about when it comes to studying. So while you're studying, do you do multitasking? We ask them questions. Do you watch videos while you're studying? And many of your students are watching videos just on the side, and it just kind of becomes a part of their life. I've watched my adolescents now, young adults, doing the same thing. It just blows my mind. They'll have headphones on too, and they'll be listening to music. We ask them questions. Do you pay attention to direct messages on your phone when you're studying? And of course, there's a range within there. So that ends up becoming one component, trying to ascertain the degree to which they're multitasking. And then focus, we had another component where we'd ask them about, do they take explicit steps to focus on their studying? Some of them would say they put their smartphone in the freezer, or it's in the other room, or they at least make sure it's powered down. Some students do that, some students do not. And as you might imagine, it turns out to make an impact. So if you go to the next slide there, Young Bach, you'll see these are the correlations then between these, specifically the resource management component and these two items. Not surprisingly, multitasking and resource management are at a negative relationship, whereas we had a very positive relationship between focus and their responses to resource management. Surprisingly, I don't necessarily see the same direct implications for GPA that others have found. And it might be because we're a little more specific about what we're asking, but it is clearly still related, how well students will focus in on what they're studying and how well they'll do at the end of the semester. We had really good data on their scores at the end of the semester. That's a little bit about self-regulation and smartphone use, and we'll kind of broaden that a little bit. But right now I'm going to turn it over to Sarah for a discussion of mindful self-regulated learning.
All right, thanks so much, Kendall. Mindfulness is the biggest buzzword, I think, of the past 10 years. We see it everywhere, and it promises all kinds of things to us. I'm sure most of you have some mental idea or picture of what mindfulness might be. And think about 22% of Fortune 500 companies are doing mindfulness at work, right? And schools in the UK have introduced widespread mindfulness programs on a national scale through the British Parliament. And places like the Mayo Clinic are really boosting its benefits. And the more popularity that mindfulness gains, really the more further reaching and diversely targeted its programs have become. Mindfulness is this term that's being employed with increasing frequency, and it's holding increasing currency. There's lots of apps these days. I'm sure you've heard of some of them like Calm or Headspace. It really is this multi-billion dollar industry of wellness now. So I think that it's really important to note before we kind of go into talking about mindfulness, where that word really came from. It was a translation of the Pali term sati, which is also sometimes referred to as smrti. And it was introduced in 1910. The word mindfulness was introduced in 1910 by this guy named T.S. Rice Davids in his translation of the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, which is a mouthful, but if you're interested, it's actually quite fascinating to read that translation, and it does exist out there. And it comes from this Buddhist tradition. And the practices of mindfulness were really aimed at freeing oneself of suffering. And that encompasses about 2,500 years of history. It spans a whole bunch of different continents. And within that Mahasatipatthana Sutta, the Buddha introduces these 4 frames of references for this practice. There's Kaya, the body, Vedana, which is feeling, Chitta, which is mind, and Dhammas, which are the mental contents. And the idea is that through these frames of reference, we can practice freeing ourselves of suffering. So these are what are largely referenced as the basic practices of contemplation during meditation, which is something you might associate with the term mindfulness. The mindfulness that we recognize today and the mindfulness that has made its way mostly into mainstream culture and in education is a secularized version of this. So Kabat-Zinn, in his work at the Stress Reduction Clinic, which founded in 1979, was really the first to make a major contribution towards the psychological literature of what mindfulness is. His definition is mindfulness means paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. So, contextualizing mindfulness, that idea within the context of education has been my research interest and just human curiosity for about a decade now. I used to be a photographer, and after a kind of eat, pray, love-esque trip far before grad school, where I traveled to 26 different countries with just my backpack and did all that, I was photographing yoga for this photography project. And I began doing these mindfulness practices, learning about this concept. I came back, I was teaching in a K through third grade as an art teacher, and I started doing mindfulness practices with my students just to help them relax, not get so frustrated when they messed up their, brush stroke on the kitten they were drawing. But I'll give you an example of what it looked like. It evolved a little bit. So I used to tell the kids, hey, imagine that your emotions are like a river and you're this boat that's floating along. The idea being that that river is going to change, and the kids would naturally assign different kind of emotions to that river. And long story short, at the end of the exercise, I'd say, okay, well, if I were to say, I am mad, or, I am bad at math, is that really true if we take our metaphor? And they would naturally answer no, right? We're the boat that's on the ride of these emotions on the river. So they would change those sentence structures. They say, I feel mad, or I feel bad at math today, and introduce this more temporal quality and dissociate, free themselves of the suffering of identifying so strongly with that emotion of being bad at the thing. And that completely could change, their interpretation of that emotion. And so it wasn't just me who was interested in this, but I decided I had to go to grad school, and I've been interested in this ever since. And researchers have really started to converge on this consensus as to what mindfulness manifests like in education, and that's as an enhanced form of self-regulated learning or self-regulation. And so you can see in this diagram, there's sort of these three dimensions of mindfulness. This idea of intention, attention, and attitude. Intention being a purposeful orientation towards learning, something that's flexible and dynamic. Attention characterized by this focus on the present moment. And attitude, which is this non-judgmental and accepting attitude, this kind, sort of calm attitude. And what really differentiates mindful self-regulated learning from just self-regulation or self-control is this quality of reperception or reperceiving. And what you can think of this like is like a refresh button, the ability to, in the moment, catch yourself, looking at that phone and not be attached to it. So you can just hit refresh, refocus, reattune, and that goes the same for your emotions, right? And for your behaviors, intentions, attention, and attitude. Shapiro describes reperception as allowing you to deeply experience each event of the mind and body without identifying to or clinging to it. So thus, our mindful self-regulated learners might demonstrate improved focus, self-awareness, stress management, goal-setting skills, metacognition, all those kinds of things. All those advantages coming from this quality of reperception. So I'm going to move forwards a slide here and just talk about a little bit more about distraction in online environments. So just last year, myself and some of my colleagues, we ran a study where we were interested in investigating the relationship just between something very simple, what we called a task-irrelevant visual distraction. And this was just a GIF of us like a door opening and closing that we stuck on the page of every question. So it was just, there was no sound, it was just this visual distraction. We assigned a group to get that visual distraction when they took some SAT reading questions. We assigned a group to get that distraction plus a countdown clock that would appear on the page, a group that would just get the countdown clock, and then we had a control group. And what we found was presenting that visual distraction really increased reported distraction, and having the clock present also increased self-reported time pressure. We didn't see really an impact on the test accuracy between those experimental groups, but this was a very low stakes situation. We used online participants through Prolific. There was no stakes to this exam, so we didn't see any changes in their test accuracy. But really, the group membership deeply influence the self-reported distraction and the time pressure. And what we also found is that mindfulness seemed to alleviate time pressure in the absence of distraction. So we measured mindfulness using a questionnaire that I developed for my dissertation around mindful self-regulated learning. And we found that when students that were reported more mindful self-regulated learning, it seemed to like help alleviate that sense of pressure and distraction. And this finding really does align with previous research that indicates that mindfulness could mitigate test anxiety exacerbated by time pressure, possibly due to more like the affective qualities of mindfulness. And that thinking about this last point, which is the relevance of the distractor towards negative affect. So we use something that really isn't attached with much valence, right? It's just a door that's opening, closing on your screen. You're not attached to that in any way. But where we take tests now, anywhere, I'm taking this meeting in my kitchen, even though it doesn't look like it, right? There are so many distractions present in our life, and especially the ping on the cell phone with the email or the text message from your friend who wants to meet. And all of a sudden, your attention is just constantly divided, right? And so what does it really mean when we show that just this simple visual distractor we saw those impacts on time pressure. We saw those impacts on distraction because it's a very mundane distractor, right? We have much more pressing distractions. And so I'm interested in doing this study in a little bit more of a real world environment and seeing kind of what we see in terms of effects when we add those things in. But for now, I'm going to move forwards and kind of talk about, okay, well, what can we do? So talking about some implications for using some of the strategies that we might devise from mindful self-regulating learning principles or self-regulated learning principles in terms of helping our students or helping ourselves kind of manage these overwhelming distractions. So I put my little refresh icon here to remind you, right, that we can always hit that refresh button. So I'm just going to talk about sort of 4 possible things that we can do. One thing is priming for distraction management. So metacognitive priming is when we prompt our students before tests or ourselves. We can do this ourselves before things like doing Zoom webinars, right? Where we encourage our students to reflect on those typical sources of distractions and maybe even ask them to develop a strategy or participate in a strategy that could mitigate them. So while they're sitting down to take their test, before the test begins, maybe say, hey, stop. Put your phone in the other room, right? Prompt them to do those activities that Kendall was finding were helping students in terms of their focus, right? And then I like to think of mindfulness as maybe needing activation, right? It's this idea we can really all buy into, this idea, oh, let's not be judgmental, let's not be attached to things, let's be present in the moment. But really being able to do that takes a certain amount of prompting or many, many years of practice doing that thing. So we can help. As educators, we can help doing that. We can prompt our students with just simple prompts to, hey, pause, take a moment, take a breath, clear the desk, clear your head, right? Is this the best time to take a test? We can ask things like that. The very simple act of taking a deep breath down-regulates the nervous system. It's not even necessarily a mindfulness practice. It gets umbrellaed in mindfulness practice, but the idea of really calming down the system before you engage in these learning activities, before you engage in taking a test, or whatever it is, before you need to go do something stressful at the DMV, right? Really, you can do it at any point, but it takes continual practice and prompting. So I really encourage, if we have teachers who are listening in on this, to try this with your students. Try prompting them every time. What happens if we always were to prompt our students to do this? What happens if anytime somebody asked you or somebody said to you, I am bad at math, if your response was always like no, I think you feel bad at math today, right? Just reminding somebody of that. And I like to think of it like how a teacher in the classroom would say things like, when you raise your hand and say, can I go to the bathroom? You'd be like, I don't know, can you? Right? It's that little language, that little idiomatic change that might make a lasting impact, continual practice over years, over a lifetime. Right? And then we've got this third point, an integrated approach to mindful learning. So is designing learning activities that integrate mindfulness practices within an academic context. For instance, during study sessions, you could encourage students to engage in brief mindfulness exercises to help enhance their focus, a bit of the priming that we just discussed, but within the context more of mindfulness. We're tying mindfulness exercise to specific subjects, highlighting how being present can aid in understanding those complex concepts. And last is this idea of self-assessment and reflection. So we learn so much simply by asking ourselves hard questions, right? Being able to be honest with ourselves about the level that we're distracted. If we can ask ourselves those questions and answer them honestly, if we're prompted to regularly self-assess, we become more and more aware of those distractors. I think a big part of why technology in particular has become this increasingly distracting environment is because we're not as aware that it's a distraction, right? We're opening our computers to do something, to engage in a Zoom meeting or to engage in a test online, and we don't turn off those notifications, right? We don't take the time to recognize how those things really impact what we're doing in the moment. And so regular self-assessment and reflection may help encourage your students or yourself to fine-tune your use. It's in itself a mindful practice to engage in self-reflection without judging, right? Without judging yourself is sort of the caveat of it being something mindful. And so with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Kendall to talk about more implications on his end.
As a segue, as Sarah's describing some of these too, it reminds me how so many of these things become just so ingrained. Conditioned is a term that you hear a lot when it comes to mindfulness literature and other things. And we're just so conditioned to accept, for example, the somewhat high intensity part of our world. We accept that the technology is always going to be there. And until we kind of hit the refresh button or step away from it a bit, we have a hard time recognizing that this has become so ingrained and so part of what we're doing. So I think that's really helpful. I think that's consistent with some of the challenges that I see around the smartphone and really our watches and other technologies that are coming forward. We've been convinced that this is just the way things are. You need to have notifications flying around all the time. You need to be constantly in touch, and that's not necessarily the case. So, but let me follow along my 4 points I want to make before we head into a little bit of discussion. I like to think of the in the big picture we kind of see ourselves as learning scientists. We're studying the brain, we're studying learning, we're studying habits, stuff. But there's really a lot of good reasons why we might ask our students to become learning scientists. I've learned so much from my classes in cognition and instruction. It just seems silly not to make sure that everybody gets exposed to these things, not just researchers. So the broad picture might be the learning scientist for the students and help them become and study themselves to some degree and become more aware. The other thing that I'm very interested in is what I call kind of the reclamation of the smartphone. We're paying for these things. We're paying lots of money actually for these things. We're paying a lot of money to services to get us access to it, but yet it's not really seeming to be serving us, right? It seems to be serving others. And we need to figure out how to essentially reclaim that smartphone. Right now, it's a distraction device. It's what it does best is distract us. It has all these different ways to grab our attention. Subtle ways, not so subtle ways. And then it's very well designed to maintain that attention too with the infinite scroll, right? So there's been all of this great research that's been done on how to make sure we are paying attention to this. And that's fed into what you've heard as the attention economy. But I think that means that we need to kind of reclaim the narrative there. We need to reclaim the device. The notifications are a privilege, not a right. That really, it amazes me how many different ways these apps and stuff come up with somehow being able to reestablish notifications. Somewhere along the line, I made some sort of change somewhere, and that clued them into, oh, we can now start to bug him again. It's like, no, cancel, no, cancel. But we have to become better at that, and especially if it's challenging for us who study these things, you can imagine what it's like for students that are, and I should make kind of a developmental note too here. That's always work with Lisa Bendixson. She's a developmental psychologist among many other things, and she's always helpful in terms of helping me understand that not everybody's a high school science teacher, and some of these things are not necessarily apply at all different levels. But I know at least with the early college student and the high school student, they need a lot of help around this to kind of work their way up to a more mature use of the technology. It's one of the things that got me interested in this initially, was talking to two of my nephews who were graduated from college and asking them about how they managed it, because they weren't necessarily the best students, as I recall, but and they used their phones a lot, but they learned quickly that they had to kind of advance away from it, and they weren't going to get to their goals if they didn't. But they needed some sort of prompting and some sort of modeling to make that happen. So reclaiming the smartphone, I think we can use self-regulated learning as a guidepost for this technology, as well as any of the other technologies that are going to come about going forward. The second thing is planning for success. So as, again, this learning scientist framework, we can help students think about, because oftentimes they know it's a problem. It was really interesting to see the survey responses of the first-year seminar students at the Academic Success Center. They're not totally oblivious to this being a challenge, but they don't necessarily know what steps to take towards making things better. And so there's all sorts of, I hate to suggest apps. Sometimes an app maybe would work, but there's other ways to think about how they might be able to better manage their time. And fortunately, some of the devices, Apple in particular, does seem to be trying to do some more screen time management types of things to encourage folks to think about how much time they're spending online and spending in front of a screen. Unitasking. We need to, every time you hear about multitasking, I really want you to hone in on unitasking. And I was in a 2.5-hour meeting this morning, and of course the laptops are everywhere. Yeah, some of folks are taking notes, but I know a lot of folks really think they're managing two things at once. And I'm sorry, you're not. You're not fooling anyone either. But we're not. We need to model that for students too. We need to get back into unitasking and recognizing that we're really best designed to focus in on one thing at a time, and we need to be helping students see that, and they need to see us doing the same thing. And then finally, technology through the SRL lens. So the latest technology now that everybody's concerned with, and this morning was no different, was what are we going to do about AI? How are we going to manage this? What are the students? We have to do something. And students are going to, I think, self-regulated learning, again, actually has some implications here, because it is about managing your own learning, managing your own cognition, and recognizing what strategies are going to be effective and not effective. So, for example, with writing with AI, what is the point of the writing assignment? And hopefully the more well-regulated student is going to have a better understanding of the writing assignment, what the purpose is it to understand. Many times I have writing assignments that are really just intended to help the student process what they read, and to demonstrate, that they have read it and they understand it and they can see some implications for it. That's really the point of it. They could have Chat GPT or something else write that fairly quickly for them, but they really doesn't get them any closer to understanding the things that we intended for them to go towards. So I really, as you can tell, I feel like self-regulated learning as a model is a way to help us think about students learning in a way that focuses in on the things that are important, that we can kind of demonstrate, improve understanding. And that is things like managing their understanding, monitoring for their understanding, managing their resources, both cognitive and as well as what their environment is like. Those can have a real impact. So those are some of the things that I think are helpful. I think that's probably our last slide. We do want to work into a discussion, just so you have our contact information, however this ends up at the end there. I don't have the slides on my website just yet, apparently, but I'll certainly email them to anybody who's interested in them. And my understanding is this will be set up on the YouTube channel. I believe we have a YouTube channel that has these scholarship and practice videos on them, so you could see them later. So with that, please feel free to put some questions up in the Q&A, I guess, if you have access to that. I see we have one right away. It looks like kind of a direct distraction one. Sarah, do you want to start with that one?
Sure. Yes, we have a question. How do you respond to a student who claims external stimuli are not distractions to them? So they claim the music videos actually help keep them focused. So this is a fantastic question. Thank you for posing it. How do we convince our students that hey, it matters? Well, there are some really compelling sort of studies out there. There's one in particular from, I believe was from UCLA. I'm going to pull it up right now. That looked at multitasking and images of fMRI brain studies. So I always really like to respond to this question is like, sure, it might help, but are you really going to learn that information? So it's about kind of convincing our students that the process by which they truly learn and retain information is sort of embedded in this idea of we really do need to focus and attend to it so we can encode it in our long-term memories. However, when we have all these distractions, we might learn something, but we're not going to really deeply learn that thing. And so it might be a function of telling your students, hey, you just need to be aware that that is happening and make the decision consciously. Like, okay, I don't want to or need to deep learn this particular bit of information. Just know that that's happening. And so I'm going to drop actually this link in the chat. So everyone, this is my favorite kind of thing to pull up and show students when this comes up is like brain scans say otherwise, right? You might not think you're distracted, but this impartial evidence suggests that really you are. Even if you don't feel you are, you are. This is what's going on in your brain.
I just want to say one thing, add on to the Nancy's question about the distraction. So one of the things that's interesting with our study, we asked students about that. Do you listen to music while you're studying? And it ended up being a bit of a confound because in terms of the relationship with kind of what we see as positive self-regulated learning strategies, and through their open-ended comments, we kind of could tease out a little bit here and you can envision actually a positive use of listening to music while you're studying, and that is if the environment is more distracting than what you're actually listening to. So if you're, for example, instrumental music, something calming, but yet we have to remember not everybody gets a room of their own, right? Not everybody has the opportunity to study in a place where they don't have their control over their environment. So there actually is the possibility of that being ineffective, although most of them are listening to instrumental music. And I think as soon as you get away from that, I think it's to be a bit of a challenge. So
that might lead into actually the next question here, which is, can you address the impact of COVID-19 and self-regulated learning? So yeah. I'm not totally sure what you mean by the impact of on self-regulated learning. There was an asterisk there. So impact of COVID-19 on self-regulated learning. Well, a positive outlook on it, I think, would be that COVID-19 really exacerbated how important self-regulated learning is towards student success, at least in the eyes of educators and parents. And I think that has actually definitely helped in the field of mindfulness, where this idea of, these affective components of learning are things that really do matter, right? Student mental health, anything that can sort of help support our students in the affective dimension of self-regulation, as well as the cognitive and behavioral. Do you have anything to add to that, Kendall?
No, I think that's true. I'm not sure if Howard's, certainly it did emphasize it. There's no doubt it exacerbated the challenges. That's what got Lisa and I interested in this, not COVID-19, but just letting students kind of out into the wild, so to speak, on these online learning materials. And it's obviously going to vary a great deal depending on the background and skills of the student and the developmental level as well. So it was huge. talk about context. COVID-19, by basically shutting everything down and sending everybody into this mode, in a matter of days or weeks, really put us through a lot of changes. So, okay, we have quite a few questions, so I'm going to try to hit some more here. Bridget noted that she was teaching ASL. College of Southern Nevada. Students are easily distracted by their smartphones. And yeah, absolutely. That's what got me interested in this, because I know it's having a tremendous impact, and it's really one of these places where we can really be very helpful to students and our peers, by the way, to help them kind of think more about what's actually happening in there. Okay, and then Shui has a question about implications of AI machine learning on self-regulation and what you think how it would think of shaped learning for the future. Yes, it's pretty amazing, folks. And if you haven't messed around with these things, it's interesting, to say the least. And it's really, I think, fascinating. And I know there's some concerns, and maybe rightfully so, in terms of we thinking about how we manage our classrooms and we do assessments and we encourage students to learn. But I do see and we're myself and a couple others are writing a paper around how does the idea of self-regulated learning shape how somebody might learn from AI. We talked in educational technology circles about kind of the 2 sigma problem. If you can have a one-on-one tutor on any material, if that person is an expert in that area, they essentially can get you 2 standard deviations ahead of maybe the more broad class and the more standard instructional approach. So there's a lot of potential there, and I've been able to learn a lot from the AI tools that I'm playing with. For example, with the programming. So you say, not only about specific topics, but give me a plan for studying programming, and there's a certification test for Python, for example. So I tell it I want a plan for this certification test and pass it, and I say I want to pass this in 6 weeks. It gives me a plan for it, and then I just go step by step through it. And I say, okay, well, now describe the subtopics in this first week here, and what kinds of things should I be able to do? And it gives me that, and then I say, okay, well, explain that topic to me and give me an example. And it gives me an example. It gives me the code. And then I try to do, I ask it to give me a problem, and it'll respond back. Now, of course, there's a lot of self-regulated learning going on from myself to do that. I have to be at a certain point. We haven't even talked about motivation, which is kind of another leg of the self-regulation world. But it's really interesting to think about. This can extend in a lot of directions, right? At this point, do we admit that we actually, this whole presentation was AI generated? And it turns out actually that we're not even here, that the voice has been AI generated. And I know it sounds far-fetched, but it's not. If you look at kind of the latest tools of what people can do with voices and the graphics, and then just asking whatever device or topic to give you something on a particular topic. And if you haven't tried this, try it in your own areas of expertise. It can be pretty impressive. It does most of them still hallucinate, but we're looking at version 1.0 here, folks. We're actually looking at maybe version 2.0 because they come out so fast and they improve so quickly. So I'm not sure I know all of the information.
4.0 in ChatGPT.
Right. So ChatGPT is actually considered 4.0. The first one we saw was 3.0. And it's improved by leaps and bounds. So I don't know if you want to add anything on that, Sarah.
Yeah, I mean, these are big, wonderful questions. And I think they're questions that I ask myself in terms of, okay, what's appropriate? How should I use AI? How can I use AI to streamline some things that maybe would be more difficult? But to the point of Sue, who just wrote something in the chat, editing AI outputs might be very instructive. And I've found that as well. I mean, I went into looking at some of these ChatGPT things from a very skeptical, kind of scrutinizing place. And I did find that one of the first tasks that I gave it was I had some APA formatted citations I needed to put them in Sage Harvard for a research article that I was submitting. So I copy pasted the APA ones in there, and I said, hey, change these, just the formatting, to be Sage. And what I found is that the AI took a lot of liberties in changing it. Those DOIs that were in there were suddenly linked to different papers. it hallucinated extra papers in my list that made a lot of sense because they took like names of authors that would write that paper and they put them in the same line. And I went through and was like, whoa, I couldn't believe what was happening. And so editing AI outputs, I think what I'm emphasizing with my students is these are amazing tools that if we can use them well, can really enhance our learning experiences, and also enhance, like help us time manage, right? There's certain tasks that AI can do that are appropriate for AI to do. But if I'm going into using AI with this baseline skepticism, right? With this baseline knowledge already of what I'm looking for in that output, right? And I think the more we can emphasize that we need to be able to discern that the output is valid and reliable to deal with these things like these hallucinations that we're seeing, is going to be a really important instructional avenue as we move into this age of AI that we've suddenly been thrust into.
So Bridget has a comment about, which I think is interesting. She asked about Grammarly, and I'm not familiar with WordTune, but I am familiar with Grammarly, and you may not have seen this in UNLV's instantiation of Google Docs, but if you're outside of our UNLV one, it's been this kind of magic write is showing up, which is essentially AI built into all of the Google tools. So your students, when they're actually writing in Google Docs, they're actually being prompted to use these things already. So and Grammarly is interesting because Grammarly, and you even think of just the sentence completion stuff that we get on Gmail and other tools. That's really the beginning of that's really what AI is doing, is it's doing a prediction of what it thinks sounds plausible and what, based on whatever knowledge it has, whatever it was, whatever text and words it was built on, it's trying to come up with something plausible. That's why we get hallucinations, is because it's not necessarily looking, depending on how you tune it and depending on what tool you use, it'll hallucinate a little bit more. But you can go from word completion to Grammarly, which ends up checking things. But Grammarly actually now has an additional tool where they will, you give them a prompt and they will actually write stuff in. So it's actually being embedded. So OpenAI is a company that they did ChatGPT. They've also done DALL-E, which does the image editing. They have several other tools. But the biggest thing that's happening is they're selling this as an API and the application programming interface, so that all of the other tools that we're using are pulling from it. So it's not just that students are going to go to OpenAI and get a ChatGPT account going. It's there. It's going to be built within whatever tools they have.
I do have one more thing to add to the AI, and it's with respect to shaping self-regulated learning practices or learning in the future, which is a fantastic question. This idea that, these prompting things, these metacognitive prompting things, these implementing self-regulated learning strategies, if we can have AI detecting different levels of trace data and how our students are navigating their courses that we might expect to map on to certain dimensions of self-regulated learning, right? They're not planning, they're not utilizing these resources. It might help us build predictive models in the moment to catch students who are falling behind or students who need assistance or need tools to support them in their learning. AI might become embedded in these learning management systems as some kind of, almost like personal learning assistants to be able to keep track of how you are doing in the course and also your patterns of behavior based off of what you're clicking on, etc. So I think there are a lot of applications of AI that we might start to see in the next couple of years as we kind of cross collaborations happen. I know self-regulated learning researchers have been looking at this idea of trace data and learning analytic data, and how can we use this data to predict who's going to do well, who we need to convince to go to academic coaching, those kinds of things. AI might be able to be folded into that as sort of help in the personalized learning experience. And that's certainly an application of AI that I would be incredibly interested in. I don't know too much about AI. I wouldn't be able to take that API from ChatGPT and make one of those. If anyone is here listening from the math department or engineering department who is interested in that, I would be so interested in chatting with you more. But I think, did we have one more question in the Q&A here?
Oh, Howard just put one up, and I'm not sure if we actually addressed all of those. I know Bridget had, how can I prevent the students' distraction in my future classes? I think I think again, developing the learning scientist means we need to talk about these things. We need to kind of come up with some ground rules in classes and decide what are the implications of having these devices available. There's research that demonstrates that just the mere presence of somebody else's smartphone is a distraction because it gets you thinking about what is coming through on your phone. And again, it's a developmental thing. Obviously, it's going to vary a great deal. If you haven't been in an elementary school classroom of late, I haven't either, but I have a lot of work with a lot of teachers who have, and there's a lot of smartphones in those elementary school classrooms anymore. So that wasn't the case when I was there. But and then the high schools, of course, they were banning them for a long time, but they gave up on that, and they don't even allow them to confiscate them anymore for whatever reason. So I don't know if I have a great answer to that, but certainly it's worth a discussion and trying to get students engaged in, what's the point of this thing and why do I need it in this next 50 minutes? What's going to happen? And what am I going to do to help whoever this happened to from here that we couldn't have done a decade ago when we didn't have that thing. So possibly the last question here from Howard is, what are some disadvantages of AI? And I have been reading a lot about this and listening to folks who supposedly are kind of forward thinkers around this. And there are a lot of people that are concerned. You may have seen there was an open letter from a bunch of tech folks that's asked for a pause in the development. There's concerns about how far could these things go, and you can envision scenarios where good thing about some of the dictators and such that have been around is they're not very smart. But once you get AI being incredibly smart, and just think how smart, well, much smarter than any of us in everything. And so you give them access to the internet, you give it all the tools it needs to program, and then people are concerned about how far that could go. That's kind of the more doomsday one. The others, it has to do with kind of the Wall-E phenomenon. Was that the name of the movie? Yeah, the movie was Wall-E, where basically everybody just gets fat and lazy, and we're hanging out, letting the ship run our show. And even at the level of the things that we're doing now, whether you're a student or you're a researcher, or you can kind of get this bit of a feeling of dismay. It's like, well, why would I go make that? It seems like that's going to be just obsolete in 6 months or something, or because that's how powerful some of these things are. So there's probably other disadvantages to AI too. I bet Howard has a few. Okay, that puts us right at 5 o'clock. I'm happy to hang around a couple of minutes if there's any more questions. But I do want to make sure there's a little bit of closure for folks who want to check out. We have our contact information on the last slide there. And I really appreciate y'all coming. I appreciate Sarah joining me on this. Like I said, she's a superstar. And someday we're all going to say, hey, I knew her when she was at UNLV. Promise you.
I don't know about that. Maybe AI will help us all be more mindful. Maybe there'll be AI apps telling us to pause and relax and help us regulate our emotions.
Thank you all.
Thank you all for being here.